a camp here, and that went back to 1960. Ed loved daring since the first time he visited back in '61, and well, let's just say Carol grew to love it. Though it had electricity, you had to pump your own water and use an outhouse, but they stayed. They raised 2 children and eventually put in some plumbing. Ed started college, but served in the Army, where he was stationed in Korea for a time, and then returned to complete his degree in biology at Roger and Williams University. As a young man, he worked in road reconstruction and construction, and later he worked with Miller Engineering, Jaworski Environmental Services, and eventually he opened his own company, GeoServe, which offered an array of environmental services, including testing, inspections, and permitting. He has enjoyed years as town selectman, chair of the Daring Conservation Committee for multiple years. Ed enjoys the rural life with hobbies that included bird and rabbit hunting, fishing, even baking pies, jellies, and cheesecakes to order, in case you didn't know. Today, Ed is sharing another of his interests with us, history, particularly that of West Deering, which is sandwiched between Hedgehog Mountain and the Kentucket River. We know this is West Deering. For some of you, this may be your first visit, or your first visit in a very long time. So I ask you to give Ed a round of applause for preparing this for our afternoon, and a brief introduction to the West Deering community. Thank you.
I'll start out by showing you what is considered West Deering. You start over here at the big bend in the river, and you go through Longwood Swamp till you get over to the ridge of Hedgehog Mountain. And you follow the ridge of Hedgehog Mountain down, all the way down here, then you come into Wilson Hill. You follow Wilson Hill all the way down till you hit the town line with Francistown. And you go across the town line here in the Bennington town line, and then you take the river right back up to where you started. So that's kind of the area that's considered West Deering. The watershed of the area, we're in all of this side of Deering is in the Kentucket River watershed. So West Deering, the entirety of West Deering is in the Kentucket River watershed. There's 4 major brooks that go into the watershed. There's an unnamed one. There's Gerani Brook, Cork Plain Brook, and Mansellville Brook. Mansellville being the biggest. It drains, all told, those brooks on this side of the mountain drain about 7,600 acres of land. There were 2 distinct areas when you're dealing with West Deering. There's the flat part and the elevated part. The flat part, we'll do the mountainside first. We've got Hedgehog Mountain, which runs along that entire slope there. And the elevation on Hedgehog, it's the 3rd highest peak in Deering. It's 1,340 feet. I remember the first time I ever saw it, I was talking with Mr. McAllister over at the farm, and I was only probably 10 years old. I looked over and boy, hill was there. I said, boy, I asked Mr. McAllister, I said, is that a mountain or is that a hill? He says, well, it all depends. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, people call it a hill till they climb it. So that pretty much answered the question for me. There's some pretty unique things on the face of the mountain over there. There's a bunch of springs, different size springs. That on the McAllister parcel that we put under easement, there's a huge spring up there, and there's a spring house built there. And they used to kind of just channel the water down off of there onto the farmland. But one year, the mill used to run off the water power in the river here. They didn't have any. The water went down so low they couldn't run the power plant. So all the workers were laid off. So Mr. McAllister, thinking as he was always on the ball, he says, that's a good chance for me to hire some of these guys, and they dug that by hand from halfway up the mountain all the way down right to his barn. And they put a pipe in it. and the water would run across underneath the road into the barn, into the cow trough. And it would go dump into the cow trough, and it would just overflow, go down into the bottom of the barn, and then run out to the river. So we never had to water the cows. The water was there all the time. Smart. There is some carvings up on the top. There's been a lot of talking about what they were. A lot of people said they're Indian carvings. They've never been studied to the extent that they can definitely identify them as that, but that was the thought. And the other thing that's pretty unique on that, it's got what they call a talus slope. In other words, the top of it is all bald. What happens is the frost gets in the cracks in the rock and it breaks it up, and then the rocks will tumble down the slope, and they'll catch on trees or whatever. So when you go up the slope there's big areas of nothing but broken up rock. It's pretty unique for this area down here. It doesn't happen too often. Up in the White Mountains and the bigger hills, it happens all the time, but it doesn't happen very often down in here. The other unique factor of it is that it's actually protected land on both sides of the mountain. You go all the way up. On the front side, it's the McAllister Farm, which is 100 acres, around 100 acres protected there. Then you go up into a series of different pieces that were protected at different times. And it's Hedgehog Mountain Forest up there, which the Forest Society controls. So the whole front and the back of it is actually protected land. There is an unfragmented piece up there between the 2nd New Hampshire Turnpike and Old County Road that's 5,875 acres. So it's quite a parcel of unfragmented land. If you go over the Falls Road, which is the other road that goes over the mountain, there's two that go over the mountain, and neither one of them has been maintained in years. There's the front one up there that goes over is Hedgehog Mountain Road, and the lower one down here is Falls Road. Falls Road had a mica mine up at the top of it, right up at the crest of the top of Wilson Hill. And that is, you can still see where they were mining up there. They used to use the mica years ago to make stuff. If you were working in hot ovens, they'd make the mica would be good for that because it could withstand the heat. Wilson Hill is the next one down. That's down in here, and that one is actually taller than Hedgehog. It's 1,400 feet. So that's the second highest point in Deering. It runs along Falls Road to the Francistown line. It's largely protected by the Anna King Forest, which is right in front of where I live down in here. The Anna King Forest is all in here. So that's another big parcel. That was protected a long time ago by the ex-governor and his wife. Wilson Hill goes down and it ends at the Francistown line. Now, an interesting point on the 2nd New Hampshire Turnpike, which runs up through there, right below, right after you go out of Deering, there's a crossroads there. Sky Farm Road goes up, there's a crossroad right there. That's called Times Square. People often ask me, why did they ever call that Times Square? Well, the reason why that was called Times Square was they used to have drovers. Drovers would drive cattle, 100 or 150 head of cattle at a time. They drive them from Nashua up to Hillsborough, Washington, Bradford, to graze all summer. Wow. That way they didn't have to feed them. So they'd graze them all summer up there. Well, when they got to the corners there, if you were coming across the other way, you might have to sit there for 45 minutes or an hour till they drive this 100 head of cattle by before you could get across the road. Therefore, it got the name Times Square. Wetlands areas in the town, Longwood Swamp, over in here. That's the biggest wetland in Deering, biggest contiguous wetland in Deering. It's got the largest deposit of a soil type that's called Sears Port muck in the state. It's the largest deposit in the state. Basically what it is, it's organic material mixed with mineral soils, and it's wet all year long, almost all the way to the top. So you get a lot of strange flowers and that type of stuff that grows in that environment. Orchid type stuff. Along the river, back of Longwood Swamp, along the river, there's a series of wetlands right there. So if you take Longwood Swamp and the series of wetlands along the river, that makes up about 25% of the total wetlands in the town of Deering, are located over here in West Deering. The wooded area along the river is about 7.8 miles down to the Bennington town line, to the Antrim town line. And it's also one of the largest riparian and migrating bird corridors. There's been several studies done on that. As a woodcock hunter, I go down there periodically. Used to, not anymore. But. History of development, settlement. The original inhabitants, of course, of this area were the Pennacook Indians, and they did not believe that the land belonged to anyone. But when the white man came, the land was only real estate to be bought, sold, and exploited. Indians left no written records, but they could travel the pathless wilderness along streams that were never bridged, over hills that were never graded, and meadows that were never drained. So sometimes you wonder if the Indians probably had the right idea. The first settlers to arrive here was in 1767, and it became a town in 1774. Topographically and geographically, east, west, and center sections of town developed because of the geography, more or less. West Deering has always been segregated from the rest of the town by the mountains. Those two roads that don't go over there make it a journey, as Michelle tells me. She takes a half an hour to come over to my house. You have to go around, you can't go over. And that's been like that for a long time. Yep, there's no direct route over there. The first traveled road. The first travel roads in West Deering here was, the first big one was the Second New Hampshire Turnpike. That was built in 1799, and that was a toll road. Where the bridge goes across the river there now, there was a toll gate right there on Holton Crossing Road. And you'd have to pay the toll to go on up the road. The road used to go from Amherst to Claremont, because Amherst at that time was the capital of the state. So that was the main road through. There was a blacksmith shop, which still stands today, and that was there in 1789. So that shows you that it was pretty well populated at that time. It was a pretty busy area there. West Deering at the turn of the century, this was the most prosperous section of town. There was a blacksmith shop, there were 2 hotels, there was a school, there were 2 railroad stations, 2 milk stations, and the Second New Hampshire Turnpike, a general store, a library, and the first doctor that ever lived in Deering. They were all along the turnpike. The hotels there were 2 hotels. The building, one of them is still there today. That's Mr. Kibling's residence, and that was the Appleton Hotel. And the other one was across the street. That was the Dow Hotel. They both did boom in business, and as I say, the Appleton is still there. In 1953, the the Dow Hotel burnt down. The Dow Hotel was made out of brick, and the brick came from right off the Second New Hampshire Turnpike on the Ellingwood Farm. There was a big clay pit, and they dug the clay out of there and made the bricks there, and that's the bricks that we used in the Dow house. So West Erin was a pretty busy place at that time. The first doctor in town lived in West Erin on Codman Hill. That's the name of the doctor, of course, was Mr. Codman, so he lived up in that area right there. The Turnpike, they used to have what they had 6 horse carriages. Those were to carry people up from going up to Vermont or to the Claremont. Outfitters were the big travelers on the road. The outfitters, they carried vegetables, meat, eggs, hay, and apples were just a few of the things. And the other big travelers on the road, as I said, were the drovers. They would drive sheep, cows, across, up and out. The railroad station. The railroad came to West Erin in 1870. It was an extension of the railroad from Hillsborough to Peterborough. The buildings associated with the railroad, there was the West Erin Station, which is still in the field down there today. The Holton Crossing Station, which is part of the Clark residence. The West Erin Station, the West Erin Milk Station. The building for that is still present today. And there was the Holton Crossing Milk Pickup Station, which is also still present today. So we've got a lot of historic buildings that are still around. The railroad abandoned the rails in 1988, and it was bought by the state, and it's the recreational trail you came over on the way in here. That's endearing. It's about 8 miles long. Cemeteries. West Erin Cemetery was the second oldest cemetery in the town. It was a donation by a gentleman by the name of John Hogden in 1811, and he gave a half an acre to the town for the burial ground. The school, the West Erin School started off in the early 1800s. It was located on the corner of Donovan Road and the Second New Hampshire Turnpike. Then there was a big move that it was too far to take the kids, because in those days there was nobody picked them up. You had to take them to school, or they had to walk to school. So they moved it up the road to the Dow property. And they had the school there, and that was until 1942, and it burnt. So they had to have school for 43, so they went to the McAllister farm and part of the barn down there, and they had school there for 1 year. Then the road agent, who at that time was Carol Green, went down to Mansellville School, and they had closed that down 3 or 4 years earlier, and he loaded the school onto a wheeled vehicle and pushed it with the town bulldozer down to the Dow property, and they put it back where the other one had burnt. And that operated there until about 1943 or 44, when they got into the Hillsborough school business. The airport, Dave Feather was the founder of the airport. Now, he came from right across the street. His mother owned the house, the big Feather house in there. An interesting story with that, the Feathers lived there for years. And when they sold the house, the guy came in and he started poking around in there, and he ripped off the wall between the kitchen in the living room, and there was a huge beehive fireplace. It had 2 faces and an oven. So they never even knew it was there. They lived there for probably 30 years and never knew that was there. The only thing that was showing was the oven on the kitchen side. It's a big round one. It's absolutely beautiful.
Still there.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yep. So the Dave Feather, he was the original founder of the airport over there, him and a few friends of his, and it originally was a grass strip and with an old taxiway. Mr. Feather was quite a character. He's the only guy I ever knew that flew a plane into a pine tree and they had to come take him out with a fire truck. Yeah, he was quite a fella. I can remember going up one night to a church supper not a church supper, but a town supper up at the town hall, and he had diabetes at that time. He was a pharmacist in Hillsborough for years, and he had diabetes at that time, so his wife, Jean, who you're going to interview, he used to be on him all the time because he loved sweets. So he was up there and he came back with a piece of blueberry pie, and his wife says, you know, you're not supposed to be eating it. So he says, yeah, I know. About 15 minutes, he come back with another piece. She says, what are you doing eating another piece of pie? He says, I've decided that life's just too short for one piece of pie. Okay, so the airport, he finally got into cahoots with Hawthorne College, and it was at one time the busiest airport in the state because they judge airports by landings and takeoffs, and of course they were running a school there, so that was a constant thing all the time. And they had 2 DC-3s over there. And the second one they had there for a few years, and it ended up they tried to take it off, and it crashed at the end of the runway. So that was the end of one of them. I don't know what happened to the other one. So Hawthorne merged with Florida Institute of Technology, and it didn't go very far before they were bankrupt in 1988. Marizon, which is a Japanese company, they bought the airport in 1990. James Rhymes, Marizon, there was a guy in charge who was pretty hep to it, and he got cancer and he died. And in Japan, they put his wife in charge. In Japan at that time, women didn't run things. They didn't go for that, and it ended up going bankrupt. And in 1990, Marizon bought it, and a few years later, they sold it at an online auction. And James Rhymes bought it from Andrew. He paid $125,000. So he just sold it last year to a gentleman from New York. So in the clubs type stuff, this is the oldest continuous operating club that exists right now in Deering. It was founded in 1949, and it's operated continuously ever since. And with that, I'll close out.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Ed.
Oh, I have a couple of things here to show you. The Cork Plain used to be a mustard ground. And they had mustards there all the way back from, let me see the year, I look at the year here. Mustard field, they operated from 1798 to 1848. And they used to have people there from Henniker, Greenfield, all the regiments. It was the regiment was it was the largest in the state. And they were on the Cork Plain down there. The reason why they were down there was because it was flat. That's how war was fought in those days. 2 rows of guys, and then. So they used to have, when they had the muster, they had a bunch of onlookers there also. And they used to bring in, a big deal was they bring in oysters from Portsmouth. They bring in wagon loads, 2 or 3 wagon loads of oysters. And they'd eat them at night out there when they were partying in the field and throw them in the ditch. So Mr. Platt called me up one day. He says, I'm running the harrow here. He says, I just turned over a bunch of, looks like shells. So I went over and lo and behold, they were oyster shells, calcified oyster shells. So this was only probably 10 years ago. So these have been around since 17 or 1800.
Wow.
Then another day he called me up and he said, I got something stuck all over the harrow. I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't know. It's stuck all over the harrow. He says, I can just about get them off. And it was this. So for years and years I tried to figure out what they were. Nobody could tell me. So one day I was down at the market in Hillsborough. The guy come along from Henniker, and he always had a railroad engineer's hat. I knew he was big into trains. So I asked him, I says, you know what that is? Oh yeah, I know what that is. What is it? He says, that's the emergency brake off of a train. He says, they used to have the big magnets on each wheel in the locomotive. If the train got away, the magnets would come in on the wheels. And he said sometimes if it was really going, they would explode. And they'd go all over the place. That's what that was. Evidently at one time, they had a runaway train. I know they had one in Peterborough, went right through the center of town, right through buildings and everything else. But once it got rolling on the slope, because they put a slope on them tracks. So. But yeah, that's this jar here that's probably 1919. This jar is probably about 1925. So, okay.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Ed. Ed, would you entertain any questions if people
Sure.
have them?
Yeah, anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Does anybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Everyone in this audience probably knows this but me, but a hedgehog, is that a porcupine?
That's a porcupine.
Okay. Because I know when I've read through early town meeting notes, they were actually giving bounty.
They were giving 50 cents a piece for them, yeah.
A nose. 50 cents
Yep.
a nose.
Yeah.
I think I remember reading a story in the history of Deering in the book about someone who lived here in West Deering and supposedly had a lot of money in gold and was seen at night on Hedgehog. They'd see his lights on Hedgehog, and supposedly he buried a bunch of gold up there. Have you ever read that?
No?
Yeah, it's in the Deering town history somewhere. I remember reading it.
Good to know.
What's the highest point?
The highest point? Clock Summit. That's in Deering. Highest point in Deering. Highest point in West Deering is Wilson Hill, 1,400 feet.
Wayne Valakovic would have disagreed with you.
He would have?
Yeah, he would have been wrong.
Yes, sir.
Ed, is there any history of any Indian artifacts being found in West Deering along the Kentucky River? Like some farmers digging up some points or maybe
I
some
know
of the
that
audience?
Mr. McAllister overturned a pistol,
Huh,
but I never heard of any Indian artifacts.
interesting.
It's strange because it's, you know, they travel through here all the time.
Right.
How much of the blacksmith shop is left and where would we find that?
When you come across the bridge, it's the second house on the right.
It's still
You
there?
go by the moat,
Mhm. The whole
Yeah.
thing is still there?
yeah,
Wow.
it's a residence now, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you can't
But at
go
one
up.
time, there used to also be a dance hall in there on the second floor,
Huh.
yeah. Anybody else?
I have one.
Yeah?
Could you explain why it was called Cork Plain?
The Cork Plain, because a lot of the residents from Antrim moved over here to settle, because Antrim and Hillsborough was settled prior to Darien. And they all came from County Cork and Ireland. So when they came over here, it was the Cork Plain.
There's one thing that you left out of Ed's bio, and that he wrote the wetlands ordinance for the town of Deering.
I did figure that out.
I also wrote this too.
The town of Deering, New Hampshire, the Water Resource Management Protection Plan from 1990.
The state put that in as effective as a state law, that every town had to have one. That's the only one that was ever produced from by someone that wasn't a consultant for the state.
Nice.
And then 2 years later, they revoked the law.
Yeah.
Of course.
This is for Michelle as much as the rest of you, but I think it'd be interesting, some of these buildings that Ed talked about, and I know there's other buildings around town, if the Historical Society could maybe make up a map, or maybe we could have an event where we could have a day where some of these are open. That we could go and see, it would be really interesting.
Love that idea. And it's on tape now, so we won't forget. Yes, love that idea. Thank you. Well, if there's no other questions, please feel free to have more coffee, cookies. Oh, yes, Betsy.
Oh, and I just wanted to make a
Oh,
quick
yes, please, Pro,
announcement.
yes.
The library is gonna be sponsoring Rebecca Rule, who is a great New Hampshire storyteller. She'll be giving a presentation at Town Hall on April